human actions have to contend with greater degrees of contingency and precarity. The pervasive influence of science and technology is such that we are arguably less physiologically attuned to the atmosphere than ever before in human history, and less culturally equipped to engage with its claims on us too. Yet, as I will argue, climate change, or climate disturbance, as it might be better termed, means that we are also more exposed to the weather in ways that we can't avoid. The disruption to Earth system processes, and in particular to climate systems both at the global and regional level, moves us into what the scientist Paul Crutzen has termed planetary terra incognita. The new climate regime of the Anthropocene entails a denaturalization of weather events. With climate change, questions of atmosphere, both in the meteorological and social senses of the word, can no longer be seen as the neutral background or empty container for human actions. If air is increasingly polluted and made toxic, it has also become a socially charged medium that is open to different kinds of manipulation by contemporary artists, architects, and critical theorists. During the Second Battle of Ypres on April 22nd, 1915, German troops attacked French, Canadian, and Algerian forces with chlorine gas. Official figures estimate about 1.3 million casualties directly caused by chemical agents during the course of the First World War. The philosopher Peter Sloterdijk argues that the use of gas warfare constituted the first, quote, airquake of the 20th century. Oxygen was long known to be one of the conditions of aerobic life, but this knowledge only became explicit once air had been rendered poisonous and deployed as an industrialized weapon of war. Henceforth, the air is no longer taken as given, but is instead revealed to be, quote, part of an air conditioning system that encompasses both natural and human environments. As Sloterdijk goes on to suggest, atmospheres, quote, had to become unbreathable for people to learn to recognize themselves as guardians or reinventors of what had merely been taken for granted, end quote. This argument could be extended to include current discussions around atmosphere. What does it mean to say that we are guardians of the air, or even to ask this question at this point in history? Sloterdijk's word choice still implies an anthropocentric position in which humans are assigned a sovereign position over the natural world. Different branches of the natural sciences commonly refer to the earth as a self-regulating system composed of a multiplicity of indivisible elements that evolve through mutual modification. Under the impact of the Anthropocene, critical theory has increasingly put pressure on the ontological distinctions among biological, geological, and meteorological agents. Accordingly, Bruno Latour contends that we have entered an ecological mutation of unprecedented scale. Quote, the sharp differences that seem so important between those who represent things and those who represent people have vanished. Elsewhere, Latour reclaims the concept of Gaia, not as a unifying figure, the ancestral mother of all life, but as the, quote, name proposed for all the intermingled and unpredictable consequences of the agents, human and non-human, each of which is pursuing its own interest, end quote. The new climate regime thus entails a redistribution of agencies. Atmospheric chemists and exponents of new object-centered ontologies, including new materialists, speculative realists, and new vitalists, all tell us that the weather acts on us as much as we act on it. Yet it is unclear where humans, or more specifically artists, fit into this picture of a world composed of multiple reciprocally linked but ungoverned self-advancing processes, as described by Latour. The effort to decenter a certain anthropocentric vision of nature, naturalized both in scientific discourse and in liberal humanism, does not amount to a denial of human responsibility for climate change. Quite to the contrary, and as Elizabeth Povinelli insists, there's a need to de-dramatize human life as we squarely take responsibility for what we are doing, end quote. Once climate is understood to be at least in part a consequence of human actions, it becomes open to different kinds of social interpretation and creative manipulation. As the literary critic Jesse Oak Taylor argues, the work of art in the age of anthropogenic climate change becomes, quote, not merely a representation of climate, but an active constituent of it, involved in the construction of atmospheres that encompass both the literal and metaphoric dimensions of weather. When we enter greenhouses, biospheres, shopping centres, airplane cabins, or hazmat suits, we enter various spheres, fragile envelopes that function to seal us off from some atmosphere but enclose us in others. Yet just as the weather outside has become progressively denaturalized and thus brought into the range of human concerns, artists and architects have developed strategies to ask what it means to be inside a particular sphere or environment. Here a number of questions emerge. What is the envelope or filter that defines a specific atmosphere? What sort of air does one breathe in it? We could ask this of this very space or any space we enter into today. What life forms does it allow and preclude? Now, I want to suggest that in the Anthropocene, the challenge open to art and architecture is not to hermetically seal us from the elements or secure our technological emancipation from them. Rather, its critical capacity is tied to the recognition of our essential vulnerability and openness to atmospheric forces that escape or resist cultural containment. Since his emergence in the late 1990s, Olafur Eliasson has gained widespread critical attention for his large-scale installations that recreate naturally occurring phenomena, such as rainbows. Here's an example of, I could come back to this, but Eliasson likes to reveal the technical setup through which he's able to actually create these naturally occurring phenomena within an indoor space within the confines of the gallery. But other examples of his work, I'm just going to briefly show some images here, and I could circle back to them at the end. But this is a creation of fog outside that, of course, he's orchestrated, and most famously his weather project for Tate Modern. So these installations recreate naturally occurring phenomenon by technical means. Through the use of colour, light, and other ambient effects, Eliasson enclosed the spectators in highly immersive but patently manufactured environments. For his most well-known commission, the Weather Project from 2003, the artist used mirrors, monofrequency lights, and smoke machines to transform the turbine hall at Tate Modern into the setting for a hazy indoor sunset. The result is a paradigmatic example of what Sloterdijk calls atnotopes, spheres of, quote, a carefully manipulated climate. And these are spaces that seem to be open, airy, and transparent, but are in fact hermetically sealed containers of experience. For Sloterdijk, atmotopes are artificial atmospheres that experiment on the artificiality of nature itself. Thus, as much as these installations preclude direct perception of the natural world or suggest that it is always already filtered, exhibitions like the Weather Project position spectators in a self-reflexive relation with regard to their own experience of atmospheres. In his essay, Museums Are Radical, Eliasson calls attention to the ways in which vast parts of the planet have come to increasingly rely on, quote, protective, climate-controlled, thermostat-regulated interiors. The globalization of this thermal modernity has resulted in what he describes as a growing awareness of energy issues over the last 40 years. In the same essay, Elias asks how architecture but also electronic media now serve to frame our experience of the weather. A window in a building can offer visual access to the outside, but it also comes to stand in for a more sensorial engagement with the elements. Again, Elias uses architecture to emphasize that our relationship to weather is always mediated. The problem with this situation, he argues, only emerges when one does not recognize that the situation in which one is involved has been mediated according to the intentions of the party mediating it. So for Elias, the problem is not that our relationship to the natural world is always mediated. It's only a problem if that mediation is not revealed or made apparent, and someone's pulling the strings, as it were, behind the scenes without us being fully aware and what kind of interests motivate that kind of orchestration of natural phenomena today. Thus, visitors to the Weather Project who walked to the end of the exhibition space would be able to see that the glowing disc at the back of the hall was in fact a semicircular screen backlit by approximately 200 lights. When this image was reflected against the mirrored ceiling, it created the optical illusion of a full circle. This strategy of artifice laid bare also comes to define the ethical mission of the museum as defined by Elias. In his words, quote, "The responsibility of the institution lies in exposing the ideology of display as an integral part of the display." So here it's just a slide showing you, obviously, that these monofrequency lamps that he's used. If you walk to the back of this hall, you can actually see the technical setup and the illusion that's given to you when you're initially entering the hall is punctured when you actually realize it's actually a half disc, not a full disc, and that the ceiling, which is mirrored, creates this optical illusion of a full sun. And he wants viewers to actually be aware of the artifice, right? To realize that what they're seeing is being manufactured. Yet if Elias's artificial atmospheres index the anthropogenic transformation of weather and air at the planetary scale, some critics have questioned the degree to which his work partakes in a climate techniques premised on a logic of control and domination of the natural world. To this end, Louise Hornby argues that Elias's, quote, fully orchestrated environments share the anthropogenic terms of the 20th and 21st centuries militarized climatology. More specifically, the use of fog in many of the artist's installations become difficult to separate from the various efforts to control the opacity of air in the age of pollution, contamination, and aerial warfare. Hornby usefully counters the pervasive fiction that Elias's experiments with meteorological states can serve as a neutral container for a phenomenological mode of inquiry whereby spectators engage in acts of self-reflexive perception or seeing oneself seeing. What gets left out in this line of critique, however, is any discussion of the carbon footprint of the museum and its problematic reliance on energy-intensive heating and cooling systems. Indeed, while Elias calls attention to the carbon emissions associated with an installation like Ice Watch, his projects inside museums consistently leave uninterrogated the various protocols that serve to regulate the temperature inside these spaces. These protocols not only have to do with the particular demands that scientific models of museological preservation make with regard to the care of physical artifacts. Standardized systems of climate control are also bound up with a deeply ingrained set of cultural attitudes about energy consumption that have been conditioned by expectations about the abundance of fossil fuels. Timothy Mitchell argues that for much of the 20th century, quote, the world's most valuable non-renewable resource could be consumed without calculating the cost of its replacement. Mitchell notes that more than half the total oil extracted in the 150 years between the 1860s, when the modern petroleum industry began, and 2010, was burned in the 3 decades after 1980. If oil has made possible a thermal modernity premised on uniform temperatures across different seasons or climatic zones, the industrialization of the carbon cycle at an unprecedented scale has altered the atmosphere such that we are no longer able to regulate global temperatures within the range that allowed human society to develop at an accelerated rate in the 20th century. Michael Asher takes up these questions of the museum atmosphere in a more direct fashion. For his solo exhibition at the Kunsthalle Bern, which took place from the 16th of October to the 29th of November 1992, Asher offered a variant on his long-standing practice of institutional critique. In his context-specific interventions, Asher calls attention to the material and discursive mechanisms through which art is framed within the museum and other institutional sites. In numerous instances, the artist uses processes of subtraction precisely to question what has been naturalized or rendered invisible within particular social and ideological systems. At the Kunsthalle, Asher had the 17 radiators that were used to heat the publicly accessible spaces of the institution relocated to the entrance gallery. Each displaced radiator is connected to 2 exposed metal pipes that run along the surface of the gallery walls. You can actually see them there. Just showing you some more images as well of that gallery space. So all of the radiators were ripped out of the other rooms and placed in just the one gallery. So that required a rewiring of the pipes that transfer the steam from a furnace to these different radiators. Each displaced radiator is connected to 2 exposed metal pipes that run along the surface of the gallery walls. The placement of these conduits, previously hidden from view, was not determined by aesthetic considerations, but by the physics of energy expenditure. With the aid of an architect, the artist was able to calculate the most efficient route for the hot water pipes to travel from valves to radiators. Anne Rorimer offers the following description of this component of the installation. Quote, installed so that the first was placed just below the lintel of the doors, the pipes converged in parallel rows of as many as a dozen tubular elements. They ran along every wall and perforce through all the doorways between galleries. By means of fitted elbow joints at architectural junctures, the pipes turned corners and responded to structural variances. They also paralleled the slant of the staircase leading to the lower level galleries and spanned the empty space between the columns supporting the arches that surrounded the stairwell beneath the Kunsthalle's leaded glass skylight. End quote. The exposed pipes lead into the other galleries, terminating at the empty niche previously occupied by its corresponding radiator. Through this itinerary, it becomes apparent that the transplanted heaters have been situated in accordance with their original positions and orientations in the rooms from which they have been removed. In this way, Asher puts one of the functional imperatives of architecture, the circulation of human bodies, into conflict with the thermal infrastructure that forms its largely invisible substrate. Museum and storage techniques have evolved under the impact of parallel advances in architecture, climatology, engineering, and chemistry. The adoption of certain standards for climate control in museums appears to be governed by a set of objective facts about how objects behave under particular environmental conditions. We know that temperature extremes can adversely affect certain materials, for example, rubber, wood, and metal, more than others, or that excessive light levels, and especially from sunlight and fluorescent light, speed deterioration of photographs, textiles, and printed or handwritten paper. It has also been long established that fluctuations in the level of water vapour in the air can damage organic materials like wood and canvas, which absorb and release moisture. Humidity that is too high encourages mould growth on paper, textiles and parchment, and promotes rust on metal. Likewise, humidity that is too low can cause materials like oil paint to become brittle and detach from their material support. However, much of this knowledge has been acquired not through tests in the controlled space of the laboratory, but as a result of human errors and historical accidents. Moreover, the adoption of climate control techniques in museums is not governed by a purely scientific set of considerations, but with human comfort very much in mind. Up until the 20th century, objects housed in museum collections were exposed to much greater variances in environmental conditions. Fireplaces might serve to make a room inhabitable during colder months, but this method of heat production had significant drawbacks. Open fires heated spaces unevenly and inefficiently, and they produced significant levels of air pollution in the form of soot and smoke. Advances in industrial technology made it not only possible to stabilise temperature, but just as crucially to significantly regulate the humidity levels in interior spaces. In 1908, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston became one of the first cultural institutions in the world to install a central heating, air washing, and humidification system. These innovations gave rise to the belief that the relative humidity, RH, levels best suited for paintings and other works of art was somewhere between 55 to 60%. While this range became a widely adopted industry norm for museum environments, it remains unclear how these guidelines were initially derived. Another major development in the history of museum climate control occurred during the Second World War, when the National Gallery in London made the decision to move its painting collection to a disused slate mine located near Snowdonia in northwest Wales. While the air temperature in the quarry was cool and constant, the relative humidity underground was close to 100%, the point at which dew forms on objects as a result of the differential temperatures between water vapour and any surface with which it comes into contact. To compensate for this, several small brick buildings called houses or bungalows were constructed within the caverns to insulate the paintings. The relative humidity target value of 58%, which falls within the climate protocols established by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, was determined by monitoring the weight of blocks of wood left for several months in the galleries of the National Gallery. The experiment made it possible to track how the intake and output of moisture compared with dry weight varied with the seasons. Based on this data, it was deduced that the average weight of the blocks in the course of a year corresponded to the equilibrium. So I might have. Go back on. Yep. Sorry about that. Based on this data, it was deduced that the average weight of the blocks in the course of a year corresponded. Apologies for that. Something was flashing up. Corresponded to the equilibrium air moisture content at 55 to 60% relative humidity. Yet the move to the mines yielded an unexpected insight. The paintings seemed to react better to the more climatically stable environment of the quarry. Indeed, when the collection was moved back to London, conservators reported an epidemic of blistering, warping and cracking, the result of the rigours of an entirely non-conditioned environment. This resulted in the introduction of temperature-controlled galleries soon after. As is so often the case, it takes something like war or a natural disaster to denaturalise the procedures that are normalised in the museum. Influential institutions like the National Gallery have set environmental guidelines or norms for museums that have since been adopted as best practice around the world without further justification. As one recent study suggests, these climate recommendations are based as much on ad hoc technical adjustments as they are on the human comfort zone and the practical limitations on RH control in museums. And that's in particular to do with like the cost of regulating temperature in certain cases. The authors note that while there is ample evidence to indicate that extremes of relative humidity cause damage to certain objects, it remains unclear how much the climate could be allowed to vary beyond the current frameworks for preventative conservation. Now, I wanted to return now to Asher and think again about what he's doing. By placing the radiators in one room, Asher not only foregrounds the physical infrastructure of heat at the Bern Kunsthalle, but additionally disrupts the set of cultural codes that governs its use in that institutional sphere. The displacement of the radiators affected the temperature of the galleries unevenly. The exhibition took place during a cold winter, and the accumulation of heating units in one room created a significant differential of temperature between it and the other rooms. While forced air tends to distribute heat more evenly and quickly than radiators, both technologies aim to provide more or less uniform temperatures across different rooms. By contrast, audiences at the Kunsthalle were asked to contend with variables that were in conflict with standardized models of thermal comfort. Through its manipulation of the heating system, Asher's work calls attention to the energy-intensive infrastructure on which much art depends but only rarely acknowledges. Museums are reliant on access to an electrical grid powered by cheap fossil fuels. This is no doubt true also of artists whose productivity is linked to the forms of temperature management that heated and air-conditioned spaces afford. The very fact that energy goes largely unnamed in present forms of cultural production has to do with the unique affordances that hydrocarbon resources provide. The point is not only that energy powers the production and display of art in the most obvious sense, but also that petrocapitalism gives rise to specific sensibilities and attitudes that are materialized in spatial practices. In this regard, the museum could be connected to a larger constellation of spaces whose social function is acutely linked to the regulation of air temperature and humidity levels. These include office blocks, warehouses, conference centres, shopping malls, airports, and stadiums. If the toxic effects of gas warfare in the mining industries point to the ultimate defenselessness of breathing, and that's a phrase from Sloterdijk, these air-conditioned containers embody a will to liberate human beings from a respiratory economy based on the laws of nature. Quote, as soon as the human dependence on air is formulated in a fundamental tone, it demands a corresponding emancipation. It calls for and achieves the active reshaping of the element. End quote. That's Sloterdijk. The second half of the 20th century marks the inception of an era of what Sloterdijk calls aggressive air design, that is as much technical as it is ideological in its modification of atmosphere and modelling of microclimates. And you would have all felt this if you go into, let's say, Yankee Candle. There is like, this intense aroma that is being kind of inflicted on you there, and it's not even subliminal, right? It's very much a kind of air conditioning of space in the sense in which Sloterdijk is talking about, and it's a conditioning of subjects as a result. We have to adapt to those atmospheric conditions that are imposed on us. Now, to put all this in historical perspective, in 1955, air conditioning systems displayed the second largest growth in all industrial sectors in the United States, second only to television sets. At that point, only 5% of all American households had an air conditioner. Fast forward to 1980 and that figure jumps to 55%. The artist Firmin Lander similarly explores how the critical operations of contemporary art might serve to analyse not only the weather outside, but also the particular atmospheres, both natural and social, that are at work in the cultural realm. For his work One Day Ahead, realised for Manifesta 11 in 2016, Lander collaborated with the Swiss weatherman Peter Wick. During each of the 100 days of the Biennale, the temperature of the television studio where Wick reports on the weather was raised or lowered according to the temperature predicted for the next day in Zurich. On a closed-loop video, viewers could watch Wick forecast a 77-degree day and then watch his physical reaction as he felt the temperature go up in the room. On one level, Lander's intervention would seem to parallel Elias's technologically assisted experiments in climate control. Both artists suggest that the experience of weather is now fully contained within the cultural climatology that links architectural practices and meteorological discourses. On another level, the intervention into the physical environment of the studio foregrounds some of the tensions that presently animate media-assisted weather communication. As a branch of atmospheric science, modern meteorology offers a rational framework through which to assign causes to unpredictable currents and turbulences. A meteorologist tries to figure out what's going to happen based upon empirical observation, measurable data, and statistical averages. But atmospheric behaviour, as I've been suggesting, involves too many variables to be predicted with absolute certainty. The further ahead the weather is predicted, the more the meteorologist works with chance and chaos. If climate change seems to drive human efforts to own the weather, Lander's work points to what eludes full knowledge and mastery. For his part, Wick admits that his analysis of the future is very much a performance. Quote, "In the media, weather forecasts are often seen as a form of entertainment, good for advertising as they attract lots of viewers." After his first visit to the Meteo News studios in Zurich, Lander visits Martin Horat. I'm just showing you here installation shot for Manifesto where people could, in the gallery, watch Peter Wick undressing or putting on various clothes in response to the climate change in the studio that was happening based on his predictions for the next day's weather. So after this project, Lander visits Martin Horat, a Swiss Wetterschmöker, weather sniffer, from the Morter Valley. Horat allows ants in the forest to climb on his body. In this way, he generates his predictions from his interactions with insects and plant life. Quote, "When the forest ants retire in their heaps, it will be cold or it will rain," he says. He also carefully examines the forest floor. If he discovers fresh sprouting mushrooms that are free of snails, this indicates that the coming week will be sunny. The comparison that Lander sets up between the weatherman and the weather prophet is not based on the criteria of factual accuracy. Rather, it points to the interplay between scientific prediction and religious prophecy that remains repressed within scientific discourses of meteorology. In the accompanying installation shown at Manifesta, Lander uses a Russian doll system of devices that modify the temperature in opposing ways. The fridge in the centre of the hut works to expend additional energy in order to perform its assigned task. So he had this hut built in the centre of the gallery for Manifesta, and then inside that he places this industrial fridge. And alongside that fridge, which of course has a cooling function assigned to it, he has this electrical-based sauna heater. And the two are obviously working in opposition to each other. The heating and cooling devices are designed to cancel each other out, such that the median temperature in the center of the work matches that of the museum which houses it. The installation models the multi-directionality the multi-directional causality of climate feedbacks when changes to one element in the system lead to an unintended set of responses, which in turn trigger further changes in the system. Like Asher before him, Lander activates thermal processes that defy notions of market efficiency, social control, and sustainable use. This is not to say that human responsibility for the environment is rendered void by the unpredictable effects unleashed by technologically assisted climate change. Rather, the recognition that climate resists calculation or containment opens up a model of engagement premised on a predisposition to vulnerability. If human life is dependent on breath, then atmosphere emerges less as an externality to which we must adapt than as something which is inside us. This challenges the compartmentalized definitions of environment that we have inherited from liberal humanism and that also persist in architectural practice. Derived from the Greek atmos, meaning vapor, atmosphere originally referred to, quote, the spheroidal gaseous envelope surrounding any of the heavenly bodies. Current Earth system science expands the concept of atmosphere to include ocean circulation and other climate-related systems, including the land surface, the biosphere, the cryosphere, such as glaciers, sea ice, and snow cover. The hydrosphere, lakes, rivers, evaporation and rainfall, and soil. Yet as an object aligned with the earth sciences, atmosphere has been seen as an invisible background for human action rather than as an active element in its own right. The critical challenge lies not simply in departing from energy-intensive lifestyles through technological innovations. The uncertainties created by climate change requires that we imagine a different relation to the atmosphere, one that contends with our essential being in the air and the sense of vulnerability that goes along with it. In their performance, and this is the final work, in their performance Breathing In, Breathing Out, staged in Belgrade in 1977 and again in Amsterdam in 1978, Marina Abramovic and Ule blocked their nostrils and pressed their mouths together, thus obstructing any inhalation of fresh air and sharing each other's exhalations of carbon dioxide. The performance, which lasted for an improbable 19 minutes, resulted in both artists collapsing from oxygen depletion. In this work, the body and its aerobic environment are conceived as reciprocally enfolding entities. The work confounds the idea of the bound itself and the sealed space long privileged by modern architecture. With industrial modernity, we have manufactured a new atmosphere that has its own cultural dynamics. It is a culture with no transcendence. The milieu that we occupy is one in which the air has been made viscous, fetid, humid, excised from the lungs and in turn inhaled. Space assumes an architectural form of breath in which every inhabitant is immersed. Welcome to the Anthropocene. Thanks very much.